everybody, and thank you so much to Michael, to Chaucer's. What a fantastic bookstore, right? It's amazing. There are always people here. It's so great. So thank you so much for this event. My name is Alice O'Connor. I'm a historian. I teach history at UCSB, and I want to thank you all for coming. It's so fantastic. It's such a pleasure to welcome my very, very good friend, as well as eminent historian and author, Scott Ellsworth, here to Santa Barbara. I'm going to do some proper introductions, starting with the fact that he's a professor in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan. But more important for our purposes, he is a prolific author in his and in his writing as well as in his teaching. Scott is just devoted to reaching a broad audience with rigorous but accessible historical narratives that take up the central questions of our time, past and present. You know, the race, justice, and democracy, if we can keep it. Just to distill all these things together. Sometimes he does this by getting us to think differently about familiar moments or moments that were less known about the past. And that was very much the case with his first book, Death in the Promised Land, which was published way back in the 1980s. And that's when I first met Scott, actually, when he was bringing that book out at an event at Kramer Books, another great bookstore, Kramer Books in Washington, D.C. And we went, and I was in grad school, and I thought, somebody can write a book but this is a story of the Tulsa Race Massacre, and it really was the first definitive historical account about what by now everyone feels like, oh, I know about the Tulsa Race Massacre, but at the time very few people knew about it, and there was a huge investment in denying that it had ever happened. Scott wrote that book, and he has gone on to do tremendous work with the community as well as in his own writing to not only draw attention to it, but to shepherd the process of thinking about reparations and the kind of coming together the community continues to try to do, to actually grapple with and acknowledge this terrible event from 1921. The most recent book that came out about that by Scott is called The Groundbreaking: An American City and Its Search for Justice, which is a harrowing story about but also it's a wonderful story about the devotion of people in the community to, again, recovering this history and to coming to terms with it in the present. He's also the author, and this is a book that I feel like I was around when Scott was, very much in touch with Scott when he was researching this book called The Secret Game, a wartime story of courage, change, and basketball's lost triumph. It is an absolutely riveting story of the first racially integrated basketball game deep in the heart of wartime, as in World War II era, and deeply segregated North Carolina. And in that book, as in so many of his other books, Scott again brings up these big thematic things about our past, but tells them from the standpoint of everyday people and the way everyday people really took incredibly heroic stances and risky stances and made a difference. And that was the first among Scott's many awards for his fantastic writing. Another World War II era book, The World Beneath Their Feet: The British, the Americans, and Mountaineering's Race to Summit the Himalayas, tells a really dramatic story of the race to the top, again in wartime era, Europe and its stakes, why that mattered, and again told with incredible verb but deep historical accuracy. So, and of course now we're going to hear much more about Midnight on the Potomac, and what you'll notice about Scott, in addition to deep research, there is great writing, essential humanity. There is sometimes a glimpse of humor about these really epic struggles, but in the end I think there's an element of optimism that despite the things that divide us, we actually can come together to figure out our way through. So with that, I welcome Scott Ellsworth to tell us more about.
Well, thanks so much. It's just a delight to be here at Chaucer's, and it's wonderful to be here in beautiful Santa Barbara. I have to tell you, it's also wonderful just to be out and about, because if you spend most of your time researching and thinking and writing about people who are on the other side of the grass, it's great to meet sentient, live human beings, to talk to them, to meet readers and potential readers, and get an idea of what they're thinking about. And you learn about yourself too, although some of the lessons weren't the ones you were expecting. So about 10 years ago, I was the last minute replacement speaker for a philanthropic organization in Ann Arbor where I live. And even though this was sort of a 11th hour thing, it was a beautiful event, a nice white linen tablecloth luncheon, and I gave my talk and that went over well, and they had arranged with a local bookstore to sell copies of my books, and I'm signing them, and there's a line, and finally there's an elderly woman who gets the last of the line, and she looks at me and says, "Well, I see you're talking at First Presbyterian on Tuesday." I said, "Oh yes, that's my church," and and I'm talking all about it, and I'm saying this is an entirely different talk that I'm doing. I'm just blathering on, and she's kind of waiting for me to sign it and to move on, and finally I do, and I hand it to her, and I said, well, thank you so much, and I'll see you on Tuesday." She sort of cocks her eyes and squints her head. She said, "Well, I'm not going to be here on Tuesday. I've already heard you speak once. Surely you don't expect me to have to listen to you again." So the good news for you all is you're now all off the hook now. This is it. So what I want to do is just talk briefly, not a super long, because I want to get Q&A and stuff from you all, to sort of set the books into context, sort of get it started, give you a sense of what it is. And just a couple of brief points to begin with. The most important, which is that to this day, the Civil War is the single most important event in all of American history. Okay? It is even more so than during the American Revolution. It's a time when questions of who we are, what our beliefs are, who can join this world's greatest experiment in democracy, were in full force. All right. During the Civil War as well, this is a time when 1 out of every 7 Americans goes from being enslaved to being free. It's also our bloodiest war. Like many of you, I was raised by the World War II generation. My dad was in the service. My mom worked in the Army. I had an aunt who was a wave. My uncles were all fighting in the Pacific, and Boy Scout leaders and Little League coaches and neighbors and all that. During World War II, 1 out of 300 Americans died in the war. For the Vietnam War, the number was 1 out of every 3,500. For the Civil War, it was 1 out of 50. Every single family was touched by this event in extremely serious ways. The other thing is that the end of the war was never foreordained. Okay, not in 1861, 1862, 1863, 1864. Now, by that, I don't mean that the Confederate flag was never going to fly over Boston Common or Central Park or anything like that. But the question was the Confederacy going to be able to survive as an independent nation or not? Or less likely, but alternatively, were the seceded states able to rejoin the Union at the end of the war, but that slavery would survive? And that's the question. That's the question we have to keep in mind. Now, despite the fact that it was an open question, in the early spring of 1864, when this book begins, there is a huge wave of optimism across the North. There's a feeling that this is going to be the time we are finally going to end this war. And there were 2 very good reasons. One was that the largest army ever gathered in the Western Hemisphere, 120,000 Union soldiers, were stationed between Washington, D.C. and the Rapidan River in Northern Virginia. And this wasn't the Union Army that started the war, that often got beaten. These were tough, hardened veterans who knew how to fight. They also had a brand new commander, but this new commander was not somebody that anyone would have mistaken for sort of a modern day George Washington, a handsome 6-footer, eloquent on a horse. Instead, he was short, he was dumpy, he wore dentures, he often wore a soiled uniform. Now, he had attended West Point, but he spent all of his spare time in the Academy Library reading Jane Austen and romantic English novels. He also served without distinction in the Mexican War, and after the war he was billeted out to Vancouver and Washington Territory, where he promptly lost all of his savings in the gambling dens of Portland. He then leaves the Army, and when the Civil War breaks out at Fort Sumter, Ulysses S. Grant's career path has taken him to be a clerk in a leather goods store in Galena, Illinois. All right? But the Union Army is desperate for officers now, so he's recommissioned. He has some early successes out west, and then in the summer of 1863, he solves the great riddle of Vicksburg, the Confederate fortress citadel on the Mississippi River, captures Vicksburg, splits the Confederacy in two. And at that point, Lincoln realized he finally had a general who could fight. All right, so Grant now comes back east, and he is now in charge of this massive army that's going to launch the spring offensive everybody's waiting for. So on May 4th, they cross the Rapidan River, and as soon as word hits the newspapers in New York and Philadelphia and Boston and Chicago, everyone's ecstatic. You know, the war is going to end. We're going to beat Lee. We're going to capture Richmond. The war will be over by the time the leaves fall. Okay, and everyone just can't wait. But instead, what happens is that Grant and his army run into a buzzsaw. First at the Wilderness, a dense, heavily forested area in Virginia. Lee is waiting for him, ambushes him, and Grant loses 17,000 casualties in that battle. A week later, he loses 18,000 casualties at Spotsylvania, which features the largest infantry charge ever in North America, bigger than Pickett's charge. 20,000 Union soldiers from 10 different states, flying 120 battle flags, often which are shot and stained with the blood of their former bearers. They rush into Confederate fortified battlements. There were too many soldiers all crammed in together. Officers can't command their men, and for 22 hours, soldiers of the North and South fight in this desperate combat. During the course of the day, it starts to rain, so they can't use their gunpowder anymore, and Union and Confederate soldiers are fighting like soldiers in the Trojan War, clubbing each other to death, stabbing each other, strangling each other. Grant loses 18,000 soldiers there, so he's lost nearly a third of his army in just a couple of weeks, and a week later, it's clear that the war is not going to end. He invests Petersburg and Richmond with a siege, and there's no end in sight. What happens, though, is there's even worse news that happens the next month in July, when a Confederate army under Jubal Early manages to escape detection. They march down, which means north, the Shenandoah Valley. They cross the Potomac River at Shepherdstown, West Virginia, take a hard right turn, and they actually invade the District of Columbia. They get inside the northern part of the district, and for reasons, and they are within 5 hours of capturing and burning the White House, the Capitol. You know, anything can happen. For reasons we don't know today, General Early pauses and takes a break, gives it one more day, and by that point, reinforcements that Grant has set up for Virginia are able to protect the Capitol. But the impact of all of this horrible news had an absolutely devastating effect on civilian morale and support for the war in the North. And there's now a new peace movement that has gotten going, and the peace movement says, we've had too much. We've lost too many of our fathers, our sons, our brothers, our lovers. Let's just let the South go and be done with it. And this has ramifications for Lincoln, and it's to the point, by the end of the summer, Lincoln himself is convinced that he's not going to get reelected, and we're going to have to cut a deal somewhere, with the South. Somebody else will end the war, but it's not going to be me. And it's just crushing after the belief we're about to end this thing, and then instead, in newspaper columns, there's just row after row, page after page, of the names of Union officers and soldiers who've died in Virginia. Okay. So what are the Confederates doing meanwhile? So they're in tough times, we're struggling along, but what those battles taught them in the spring is that they cannot win their independence on the battlefield. They are determined to keep their country free. There's no lack of fight whatsoever. But they realize we can't, in a war of attrition, we're going to lose. There's more people in the north. They can replace their soldiers. We can't replace ours. And plus, their armies are now stuck in a static defense of Richmond and Petersburg, and they can't move, which was one of their great, abilities. So what they decide to do is they're going to find a new way of fighting, and what they end up doing is they launch a terror war against the civilian population of the North. This is a well-funded effort, much of it run by the Confederate Secret Service that sets itself up in Montreal and Toronto. They have $500,000, and necessity is the mother of invention. A group of Confederate Secret Service agents and escaped POWs dressed as hunters leave from Quebec. They invade Vermont into the town of St. Albans, Vermont. They rob the bank, they kill some people, they shoot up the town, but it causes panic across New England. Where are the Confederates going to strike next? And the fact that they had actually made it into the District of Columbia, the Confederacy is not on its last legs whatsoever. There was an effort to capture a steamship on Lake Erie, to use that to attack shipping on the Great Lakes. There was a former Georgetown school teacher who became a Confederate spy, who every day is in Lafayette Square that summer, across the street from the White House, and he's taking note as to when Lincoln rides alone in those days from the White House to the Soldiers' Home, where his family lives during the hot summer months. There is a pro-Confederate doctor who goes to Bermuda, where there had been a smallpox epidemic. He buys the clothes of the dead with the idea of reselling them in public markets in New York and Boston as a way to, create an epidemic. Whether he could have done that or not, their plans to blow up the White House. There was a Southern-born former chemistry professor at Columbia and Princeton. The war breaks out. He goes to the South, lends his help there, and by the end of the war, he's inventing poison gas to be used against Union troops. So, and the most spectacular event is when in the fall of 1864, 8 different Confederate Secret Service agents under aliases individually leave Montreal by train. They come to New York City. They check into 19 different hotels. Then they go to a chemist's house a block off of Washington Square, where they buy vials of something called Greek fire, which is the metal sodium that's held in suspension and liquid. When you break these open, they burst into flame, and they set fire to 12 different hotels with the idea of burning down Manhattan. They might have been able to do it, but they didn't know that in November you have to open the windows of their rooms so the fire will quickly spread. So there's no lack of desire by the Confederacy to win this war. If you think of the terrors in England by the IRA, it's something along that line. They're trying to move the needle of public opinion, but they had one other weapon as well, and that weapon was John Wilkes Booth. Okay, so I'm here to tell you that the version of John Wilkes Booth that I was taught, incidentally at Robert E. Lee Elementary School, but is also the one that you were taught, is wrong. The one that we were taught, was that Lee was this second-rate actor, second-class actor, living in the shadow of his far more famous actor brother and father, that he was emotional, irrational, kind of a loser of a figure, kind of an archetype of a John Hinckley or Lee Harvey Oswald. And it turns out that wasn't what that John Wilkes Booth was at all. And the reason for that is because, thank goodness, that the Civil War has never been the sole property of academic historians, but there have always been amateurs out there who become passionate about the Civil War, about an aspect of it, and they study it. And there was a gentleman now deceased named Arthur F. Lew. He was a husband, father of daughters. He spent his career working for an insurance company in Pennsylvania, but in the evenings, on weekends, on family vacations, and he begins this in the pre-Ancestry.com, newspapers.com era. He set out to find every single scrap of paper, newspaper report, having anything to do with John Wilkes Booth. And he puts together a 300-page book, posthumously, more or less self-published. And it's John Wilkes Booth day by day. And I had a copy of this thing, and it's amazing. It'd be like Tuesday, October 13th, 1864, Booth played Hamlet at the Metropolitan Theater in Cleveland. Wednesday, the 15th, he rode by train to Chicago. On Thursday, the 16th, he played Hamlet at the Michigan Theater, on and on and on. And I started reading the reviews, and Booth was a superstar of the American stage. He sold out audiences, you know, from Portland, Maine to St. Louis, Chicago to Baltimore to Washington, D.C. Hundreds of people are turned away from his performances. Dozens of women would hang out outside of his dressing room trying to get a glimpse of him. There's a wonderful actress, I'll mention her again, named Clara Morris, and she described how the day after a performance, he would go into some cafe or restaurant to get breakfast. Here are all the other diners. All of the waitresses would ignore you completely and just gather around. Would you like some more coffee? Would you like steak with your eggs? Chambermaids would sneak into his room to set the pillows just perfectly, things like that. He could play tragedies, he could play comedies, he could play it all. He was also incredibly athletic. He had John Ford of Ford's Theater build him a 12-foot cliff that he would leap off in Macbeth in a single bound. Actresses that worked with him would complain about their hair getting torn out, their costumes getting ripped, and stuff like that. But his great, so he brings this new physicality to the American stage nobody had seen. And this is, we don't have television, there's no film. I mean, this is something very exciting. Shakespeare, though, was his specialty. And the reviews of him are just astonishing. Genius, genius, genius. New York Times, Chicago Tribune, Philadelphia Inquirer, Indianapolis, Cleveland, you know, Nashville, on and on. It's as if Shakespeare wrote these words for him. We've never heard Shakespeare so fresh before. There's never been a better Richard III on either side of the Atlantic. And Richard III, which is Shakespeare's mad, deformed king, was his great specialty. He could play them all. He played all of them. But and the height of that play was at the end, where there's a sword fight scene between Richard and the Duke of Richmond. And Booth would insist that it be as realistic as possible. And one night, I think it was in Indianapolis, the actor playing Richmond forgot the number of right blows versus left blows. He came down full force on Booth's forehead with the sword, splits his eyebrow, blood is spurting all over the place. The actor playing Richmond is, you know, aghast, and Booth is like, "Come on, man, what are you waiting for? Save the fight, you know, go, go, go." And whenever this fight would happen, the entire audience would rise to its feet. They'd never seen anything like that. So I'm reading this stuff and I'm saying, if we've gotten Booth so wrong, his personality, what else is wrong? And I dug back in, and there's been good work done by obscure amateur historians and whatnot, but what I discovered is that Booth had a lot of contact with the Confederate Secret Service. And time after time after time, in the late summer of 1864, there's good evidence he went to Boston and had a meeting with at least 3 members of the Confederate Secret Service who had come from Canada under aliases. 3 weeks after that, Booth makes his first trip ever out of the U.S. He goes to Montreal. He stays at the headquarters hotel where the Confederate Secret Service is headquartered, meets with other agents there, and then 3 weeks later, he goes to his boyhood home in Baltimore, calls up 2 of his high school buddies, and John Wilkes Booth, who's an actor, now is an expert on how to kidnap someone. He says he tries to get these guys in a kidnap plot. He says, I know the exact route that Lincoln takes when he rides from the White House to the soldiers' home. He goes up 14th Street, turns right on Columbia Road, all of that. He says, I know how to transport a person or a body across the Potomac River south of Washington, D.C. All of this, he says, I've got all the money for this and all the guns. Well, John Wilkes Booth did not think this up on his own. And in fact, Clara Morris, who I'd mentioned, this actress who was a great friend of his, and also acted with him. She had a long life. She lived until the 1920s, but she wrote a memoir in about 1908, Life on the Stage, and she wrote that, you know, that John Wilkes Booth couldn't organize a single thing. He was a romantic character, but the idea that this was his idea to kill President Lincoln is absurd, and that he was clearly the pawn in someone else's game. Now, I have to tell you that there's no smoking gun. We don't have a single document, and not surprisingly, because Secret Service agencies don't keep a lot of documents. And as soon as the Union Army busted through at Petersburg, they burned everything they could in Richmond anyway. But there's a lot of smoke. So let me just close just with a couple thoughts on the book, and then I'll open things up. You know, if you look at Civil War books, 85% are all military history. They're about generals, they're about battles, they're about regiments, they're about tactics and strategy. And I love military history. There's nothing wrong with that, all right? Then there's another chunk of books about Lincoln and the politics of the era. Then there's a pretty skinny little line of books about the African American experience, and an even smaller one about women during the Civil War. But here's the deal. The Civil War was the first modern war in world history. It didn't start that way. It started like a Napoleonic War with neat lines of infantry at Bull Run, and ends 4 years later in the mud and trenches of Petersburg like World War I. But the point is that the entire societies on both sides were organized for the war effort. Women are absolutely central to this story. African Americans are central to the Union victory. Lincoln said if it hadn't been for black soldiers, we would not have won. And so what I've done in this book is to bring these elements to have a larger picture of the war. You'll meet some people you've heard of, but you'll meet a lot of others that you have not. And finally, let me just close with this. You will find familiar figures in the book. I mean, Lincoln, obviously, Sherman, Grant, Lee, Jefferson Davis, but you know, it's very important to why the war ended out as it did. But in the end, you know, it's really has to do with this remarkable and unprecedented coalition in American history of men and women, blacks and of loyal citizens, men and women, blacks and whites, native born and immigrants, free and unfree, who joined together. They defeated the Confederacy, they destroyed slavery, they preserved the Union, and they gave our country a new chance to have a better job of living up to our founding principles. And this is, you know, all of us stand on their shoulders. This book is in part a hymn to them. And it's also a reminder, and we live in a cynical age, and young people are particularly cynical. And to remind us, we have wonderful heroes in our past, people who gave their all to, you know, to freedom and liberty and things that we cherish in our country. They saved their country during their time. Let's hope that we can during ours. Thank you very much.